to really restrict your questions to that domain of topics rather than stray out into medical and nutrition questions, for example, which falls outside of my area of comfort. But as we get started, I want to mention a couple of housekeeping tips, and that'll help us move through today's office hours. And the first one is, I encourage you to participate. And if you have questions or comments, feel free to enter those in the dialog box that you'll find in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You'll see the box that says Add Question Here, and those will make their way into the queue that you see on the right-hand side of the screen, which leads me to the second item I'd like to mention, and that is as you look at those questions that are already loaded, you'll see a heart-shaped icon. And if you would like that particular question addressed sooner than later, then go ahead and click on that heart icon, and it'll push that question up in the queue so that I will answer it sooner. But as always, I will get to all the questions today. All right. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the questions and have a nice discussion around all of the topics. All right, so we have the first couple of questions from Robert. And so to begin, Thanksgiving is often a challenge for vegans in a non-vegan world. What whole food, plant-based main course dish would you recommend that everyone could enjoy? Well, a few things come to mind, and one in terms of a sort of a general way to think, of course, is to picture an item that would, of course, make a nice replacement to that otherwise traditional image, right, of a centerpiece, right, which is typically a large bird or an animal cut of some sort. It's hard to replicate exactly that look and that maybe that ambiance that comes out of that with a plant-based dish. But what comes to mind for me are often one-pot meals, a casserole type of a preparation, or something sort of in that category of visual presentation, but that is a little more assembled and purposeful in that way. So, items like manicotti or lasagna, even enchiladas come to mind. And also a preparation that I enjoy from our Ruby recipe collection is the cauliflower steak preparation. And that comes with some suggestions for at least 3 or 4 different sauces. And I happen to lean toward the chimichurri, but the others are very nice as well. The herbs and the peanut sauce and the other variations. So those are some things that come to mind for me that visually look attractive. They are substantial, and again, draw the eyes in as a centerpiece could and should. They're also very tasty. They hold heat very well, and so they have that nice, comforting feel on the palate as you bite into them. Okay. Another thing along that line of temperature and comfort is to consider heating your plates. And, if you've got a plate warmer, of course, that's probably the easiest way to handle that. Otherwise, to warm up the oven to whatever the lowest setting is. Often it's 170 degrees, which is still pretty hot. But warm it up and then turn the oven off, and then place a stack of plates in the oven, allow them to warm up for, could be 15 minutes or 30 minutes, something like that. You might even consider cracking the oven door to let some of that heat escape, because 170 degrees Fahrenheit is still pretty warm to the touch once those get to the table. But, plates will then hold the heat for for a little while, right, as people get seated and as the first warm items are dished up. And that, I think, also enhances the feel of these oftentimes smaller in individual size plant-based items that we might have as a focal point. Okay. And yeah, I don't think you need to reach for a tofurkey. In other words, there are some other interesting options out there. Enjoy. All right, and let's see the next one. Okay, from Marina. She says, a suggestion for Robert about Thanksgiving. I'm making a 5-course dinner based on Mexican cuisine, hopefully avoiding the pitfalls of traditional holiday food. Great. I think that's a wonderful picture already in my own mind, right? A Mexican-themed holiday dinner. And, which, of course, brings up the point of discussion that we can certainly craft a Thanksgiving meal around any sort of a global regional cuisine flavor profile. And, so long as, of course, you're comfortable right away, sort of breaking the mold and stepping away from, what we call the traditional North American look, right, to the Thanksgiving table. But I tell you, the reaching for some of the global cuisine flavor profiles is really a wonderful way to go. I hope you'll give that a try too. Thank you. And then the second item from Robert. I would like to bulk cook potatoes for use during the week. Do I store peeled, parboiled potatoes as is in a container in the fridge, or should they be stored in water? Would they still be okay to use 3 or 4 days later? So let me answer the last question first, and that is 3 or 4 days of shelf life should be no problem for potatoes in any state of preparation. Because you're talking about parboiled or partially boiled, right? Partially cooked potatoes. I guess the first, clarifying comment or question that I would, I would ask is that, you do have plans to finish them off, right, in some way, not just to simply reheat, but also to finish the cooking process, right? Now, I would be apt to store those without any water. If the potatoes are cut and not cooked at all, then they go into water. I think that's the perfect way to store them in that case. But once they are cooked or partially cooked, go ahead and store them in a container of your choice. And as with any leftover item at this point, because it is partially cooked, it's going to be considered a leftover item from a food safety perspective. I would suggest always using a clean utensil to remove the items from that container as you're taking smaller portions out, rather than bare hands, so that we can avoid the introduction of additional bacteria that would shorten the shelf life. Okay? All the best. Thank you. All right, next up from Sammy. What is the difference between red wine vinegar and red vinegar, as well as apple cider vinegar versus normal apple vinegar? Also, baking powder versus baking soda versus bicarbonate soda. Aha, so we've got a few questions rolled into one. And let's take a look at this first part. So red wine vinegar versus red vinegar. So, vinegars are based on some sort of a liquid, which is going to be based upon perhaps some other ingredient that's been combined with a liquid that goes through a fermentation process and then further processing. And so the difference between fundamentally any vinegar is that base flavor. So the base ingredient would differ. Now, in the case of red wine vinegar, the base liquid would be red wine, which goes through a further fermentation. And then red vinegar. So here, what I'm reading into your question, Sammy, is a Chinese red vinegar, in which case we will be talking about a type of vinegar that's usually based upon rice. And it could be a variety of red rice. Sometimes there is a red or a sort of a deep purple colored mold that's introduced along the processing path, which results in that red color. Okay, but again, it's going to be that base ingredient. In this case, very different though, right, between red wine vinegar and perhaps the Chinese red vinegar. Regarding apple cider vinegar and what you're calling normal apple vinegar, in my experience, apple vinegars fundamentally are the same thing. Okay, so the word cider, can refer to freshly pressed apple juice. The word is also used with fermented apple juice. Okay, and so the starting point is still the same. It's going to be apples and apple juice. One describes a product maybe that's already been fermented and one step closer to making vinegar. But here, in my experience, these two would be fundamentally the same thing. Okay, and then the last question is a comparison between baking powder and baking soda, and also bicarbonate soda. So let me start out by saying that sodium bicarbonate is the same thing as baking soda. Okay, and when you use baking soda in a recipe, it requires the addition of a liquid and an acid in order to activate. And so this is why in a recipe that calls only for baking soda, you would typically see those two additional items, right? A liquid and an acid, or perhaps it's an acidic liquid, such as buttermilk. Okay, and then that will allow the sodium bicarbonate, also known as baking soda, to activate, produce gas, and to provide the chemical leavening in that recipe. Now, when it comes to baking powder is basically baking soda plus an acid already built in. So the acid, of course, is going to be in a dry form, so that all you need to add is a liquid, okay, to get that baking powder to activate. Now, that's sort of the fundamental difference, but today, at least in North America, for the most part, what we find on the market is what's called double acting baking powder. And a double acting baking powder also has the addition of a chemical that reacts when exposed to heat. All right, so it acts twice. It's double acting. So you've got the addition of liquid that will activate a portion of it. And then once you put that batter into the oven, the heat will trigger the second stage of gas production for chemical leavening, in that item. Okay. Now, if we step back to baking soda for a moment, one of the disadvantages perhaps is that if you were to mix up a batter and have to step away from that, because the baking soda is going to start its activation process once the acid and liquid are mixed in with it. If you had to step away from that or otherwise leave that batter for some time, it's possible that you lose some of the gas that's produced to the environment, okay, before you have a chance to put it into the oven or otherwise cook the items, such as pancakes or hot cakes on a griddle. Whereas if you are working with baking powder, you've got that first stage of activity, right, when the liquid is mixed in. And if you happen to step away at that point, you have that second stage, right, that's activated by the heat in the oven to help produce some additional gas for the rise. Okay, so that's the basic difference between those two products. Thank you. All right, next up, what is the best way to keep lemons from drying up and turning hard? Well, a few things come to mind, and in the especially in the I guess in the world of restaurant purchasing, which I was central to for many years. The first thing we talk about is to take a look at our usage rate of a given item, and then to purchase an amount and also in a frequency that will match the usage rate, right? So that we don't have extra that can spoil or in this case dry out. All right, so that would be the first thing to consider. Another thing is to consider preservation techniques, and this is, of course, the old school method, right, of addressing products, especially at times of harvest, like this time of year, when all of a sudden, right, we have an abundance of things, and we'd certainly like to capture them, to use them, throughout the next several months until the new crop came about. And so if we, approach this with that in mind, there's always the idea of pickling or salting lemons, right, which is a North African and Middle Eastern tradition. And, very simply, if you pack lemons, they can be whole, you can halve them or quarter them, but pack those in salt and just let them sit for probably 6 or 8 weeks at least, but they will last much, much longer than that. And then you can use those lemon pieces usually in a savory application, right, where you also want some salt added to the preparation, and you can cut off small pieces, or use it however you need to at that point. But those are a couple of things that come to mind. Otherwise, when it comes to citrus fruits, typically if we wrap them up to avoid the evaporation and the drying effect, they will develop mold at some point. So I don't recommend doing that. Okay. But otherwise, see if you can adjust your purchasing quantities and also frequency. Consider pickling. You might even consider freezing, right? In which case I would recommend you cut the lemons into pieces that you would typically use. And then you can store those pieces individually so that you can easily pull out a quarter of a lemon, for example, and use that, however you normally would. At that point, you could juice it, once it's thawed, or you can drop it into a soup or a stew to add some aroma and as well as some sourness to adjust for taste. So again, those are a few things to consider. Thank you. And next up from Helen. We are asked in the activity exercises to comment on the flavor profile of the dish. I was just wondering if you could help explain what you're looking for. Yes, and so in particular, right, in our pro courses, the pro plant, as well as the pro cook courses, those are the longer 6-month courses, we ask for a little bit more from our students. And when it comes to the photo upload assignments that come to us, to our chef instructor team, we ask you to comment on the taste, the flavor, the aroma, and the texture of each of those items. And, the idea here is to encourage you to engage at a deeper level with the ingredients, with the cooking process, and with the end product that you have produced, in order to learn a little bit more about food and their characteristics. And so, just as, let me talk through some of these terms. So, taste refers basically to those aspects of the food that we pick up on in our mouth primarily. And so, you've got sweet and salty and sour and bitter, and there's astringent. There's also pungent that can be included in that as well. And again, those are all sensations of one sort or another that are perceived in the mouth. And often confused with the word flavor. So let me talk about flavor a bit here. Flavor is what we pick up from the olfactory sensory area, which is in the nose and at the base of the brain up here. And so our sense of smell constitutes 75% or more of the flavor experience. So for example, if you have a lemon, right, a common taste associated with a lemon is sour. But the flavor, right, would be that lemony flavor that we associate with lemon, right, versus an orangey flavor or a limey flavor with other kinds of citrus fruit. Okay. Now, if we take a look at the other parts of this assignment, so you've got the taste and flavor. There's also, what did I say? Aroma is part of that as well. Okay, it kind of rolls into flavor. Those overlap quite a bit. And then the last one is texture. And then the texture is going to focus on those physical attributes of the food that we can see with our eyes and then also perceive on the palate. We might even feel them. We can even talk about that when it comes to the food. I think that can be important sometimes. So, take a look at, descriptors, whether it's a smooth or coarse or, grainy or fibrous or, whatever those words might be. And then we also think about the finish on the palate, which is part of the, I guess I'd call that the flavor and aroma category. But the finish is often discussed as how quickly the flavor dissipates or how long that flavor sensation stays around on the palate. And there are some foods where the flavor it seems like seconds after we put it in our mouth and swallow the food, the flavor's gone as well. But there are other things that will hang around, and we are able to enjoy them for what seems to be a long time after that food has been swallowed or that beverage has been swallowed. And that's going to be what we call a long finish. Okay. And so just some things to think about, as you think about and engage with the food. Okay. And then, do your best to start to pick up on some vocabulary that you can use to start to describe some of those different sensations. All right. Thank you. Leslie is asking, how do you know when mushrooms have gone bad? Typically mushrooms will take on a slimy feel to them. So I'm thinking about fresh mushrooms that fundamentally have a dry surface, and not all of them, but probably most of them that we have typical access to would have a dry surface, even though they might be quite moist to the touch, if that makes sense. And so they will take on a more slimy sensation tactily. And then when you look at them, you will typically start to see some dark spots develop. And the mushroom will start to recede in those areas that are starting to spoil, which allows you to trim off some of that area if you'd like to, and then use the rest of the mushroom. All right, thank you. And next up, I saw that you have experience with Indian cuisine. I love to cook Indian food, but since it uses a lot of whole spices, there seem to be two options: fish them out before serving or risk biting into them. Is there a better way to handle this? My quick response is no, there's probably not a better way. If you're cooking with whole spices, because whole spices really are wonderful foods. And, in terms of that freshness of flavor that you get from whole spices. However, if the whole spices are truly troublesome, then there's always the option of grinding spices. And you can either grind your own, which is probably the best way to approach that, so you can maintain maximum freshness. And there's always the option of using a pre-blended mix, that would suit a particular dish or type of food that you might be making. So those are convenience products that are available at Indian grocery stores. But otherwise, coming from a South Asian cultural context, it is quite understood and accepted that whole spices may be used, and whole spices are also really just a very nice way to impart flavor. So that's kind of the context in which I learned to appreciate Indian food. And so I'm always excited as a consumer to see the whole spices in the food. But I do understand what you're saying. So consider the ground option and see how you like the results. Thank you. All right, next question. Now, how do carrots with the green tops compare with those that have the tops removed? Healthier, more flavorful. Also, are baby carrots just a different variety? And how do they compare with the regular sized carrots? Do you just use them for dipping or cook them? Okay. We've got a number of questions here, and so let me take them in order. So how do carrots with the green tops compare with those that have tops removed? Are they healthier? The carrots themselves, I would imagine, are probably pretty darn similar. Very often, I get the question around, what's healthier, this version or that version, of a given item. I want to touch upon that for a minute or two here before I move on to the remainder of your questions, Carol. But for everyone here, as we think about an orange carrot, and we want to compare it to another orange carrot that might have, in this case, the greens attached to it. Please do keep in mind that it is very, I'll say, difficult to tease apart the difference in nutritional quality between those two items. Now, perhaps if we have access to a laboratory and could run at our discretion, at our convenience, these nutrition profile tests on food, we can come up with an answer. But as soon as we store the food for some X period of time, or cook it in a certain way, or combine it with a different food, then all of that data changes, and so it becomes almost, in my humble opinion, a moot point to worry too much about the comparison, the nuanced comparison of some of these foods. Instead, let's enjoy them through the beautiful cooking skills that we can apply to them. But going on to the other parts of your overarching question here. So is one more flavorful than the other? Not necessarily. Certainly if they're the same variety, then the carrots themselves are going to taste the same. The carrot tops have their own distinctive sort of intense green or grassy flavor to them. And the tops are certainly edible. I like to cut those finely and add them to a soup or a stew or a savory pancake. Even a smoothie from time to time, although they can be very fibrous. Okay. Then the next question, are baby carrots just a different variety, and how do they compare with regular sized carrots? So here it depends. If we're talking about simply a very young carrot that was harvested from the ground, then it is just a young scaled down version of its larger, more mature counterparts. There's certainly going to be some differences, however, in sugar content, starch content, and therefore in nutritional profile in some way. But once again, I don't concern myself with those nuanced differences. Now, sometimes we'll see what are called baby carrots at the grocery store, which are these little nubby carrots, which are actually made from larger carrots that have been sort of sanded down, ground down on the outsides to resemble little round pieces and to be very similar in size and shape. And so that's typically how those are handled in the processing factory. And, in terms of how do you use them, certainly dipping is a great way to use them, but also to present them as a vegetable on the plate. Now, here, when I say that, I'm suggesting that you use the whole intact baby carrot on the plate, and then even leave a little bit of the greens attached to it for a very attractive look on the plate. All right, give that a try. Thank you. All right. Is there any guidance on how much a medium onion or small onion should weigh? There are some industry guidelines, produce industry guidelines. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure if I'm going to remember the correct numbers, but if you look them up online, you can come up with more precise numbers. Let me go back to my purchasing days here. So a large onion is probably in the neighborhood of 16 or so ounces. That's going to be a pretty good size. That's probably a jumbo. As we scale down, large and medium, I'm going to say probably something closer to 10 or 12 ounces, maybe even 8 ounces for a medium-sized onion. Small onions, maybe 5 or 6 ounces or so. Okay, but I always remember there's a little bit of range in there. Not to mention there's going to be some range in terms of what different people expect as well. But use those numbers as a starting point. All right, thank you. Kathy asks, what's your favorite recipe for infused tofu? And so, here I'm reading this as a marinated tofu, one that I then might use for grilling or for baking, right, as we present in a couple of our recipes and at least one of our assignments. And, having grown up in a Japanese influenced household, I am always reaching for soy sauce. And, for me, tofu and soy sauce go together. And, to that, I have learned to add a lot of different things depending on what's in the fridge or what sort of a mood I might be in. And, so it could be simply soy sauce by itself. It could be lemongrass. Maybe it's some sort of a chili, whether it's a chili sauce, like a sambal, a chili paste. Could be fresh chilies, could be dried chilies. Star anise is something that I like, as well as Szechuan peppercorns. And so these things will find their way into a marinade from time to time. And then there's also citrus flavors. And there's a product called ponzu, which is a yuzu or a Japanese citron flavored soy sauce and vinegar. It's a standalone dipping sauce as well as a marinade in these instances. And so those are a few examples that come to mind. Thanks for asking. And let's see, next up, I purchased a 20 gauge stainless steel half sheet pan that buckles as I remove it from the 400-degree oven. Sometimes the roasting vegetables pop up and off the pan. What gauge do you recommend? I see aluminum comes in a higher gauge, but I avoid cooking with it. Okay, the first thing that I envisioned was a heavier gauge aluminum sheet pan, because that's what I grew up with in restaurants. That's typically what's used. And, if we reach for something like a 16 gauge or a 13 gauge is pretty heavy. And certainly the heavier the gauge, smaller the number, right, heavier the gauge, the more resistant it's going to be to any buckling or warping in a high heat oven, especially something at or above 400 degrees. If you want to stick with stainless steel, same sort of guidelines. If you can find a sheet pan that is heavier, maybe 18 gauge or 16 gauge, give that a try. The downside with stainless steel is that it gets expensive pretty fast. And as you start to, increase the thickness of that material, you could find perhaps the price being prohibitive. But most definitely, give it a try. I haven't, used a stainless steel sheet pan in a very long time. I don't remember what gauge it was because the aluminum versions are just so common. Okay, but definitely, move on up in thickness, which means smaller in number, and see if you can find something that's satisfactory to you. Thank you. And next from Ellen. I just ordered some traditionally made sorghum syrup, and I'm interested in not only using it as a sweetener, but bringing its unique taste notes into savory dishes. Do you have any experience using sorghum in this way? Yes, was it a couple, 3 years ago, a friend of mine from Mississippi visited right around this time of year. He was here over the Thanksgiving vacation, and he brought me a sample of sorghum syrup. It's very easy to find down there compared to the Portland, Oregon area. And sorghum has got beautiful flavor. It's got some earthy hints along with some very nice sweetness, and of course a nice rich look in its molassesy brownness as well. And I enjoy a light drizzle of sorghum over roasted vegetables that have been finished or combined in some way with herbs and seasonings in terms of salt, right, to bring up that palate interest. And then the introduction of a little bit of sweetness with a light drizzle of sorghum syrup is just a very nice way to go. So that's going to be one suggestion. I have enjoyed sorghum syrup over hotcakes on a Sunday morning in place of some other syrup. And I think there's so many beautiful syrups out there, but sorghum can fit that bill very nicely. And, also, consider it just as a general sweetener in a stew or a soup, and, see how you like that. Okay. But I think the idea of drizzling it over grilled or roasted foods allows you to see it, so you can take advantage of a nice presentation with the darker drizzle against a lighter or brighter contrasting background. And you got something to talk about at the table as well. I'll give that a try. Thank you. Okay, so next up from Judith. Thank you for your discussion on a flavor profile. Yeah, you bet. You're welcome. That helped me immensely. This is much clearer than anything I've read in my class. So you might want to add this to the professional plant-based certification class. Thank you very much for your feedback. I will definitely consider that. Thank you. And next up, I'm looking for a set of knives. Are there any recommendations before starting my cooking class? Well, Daphne, you're asking a really big question. The world of knives, as you have probably noticed, is huge. And, you can pay relatively little for knives, and you can pay lots and lots for knives. And, certainly, if you're, in the space to have 2 or 3 or 4 knives custom made, to fit your size of your hand and the style of cooking that you'll do, that would be a wonderful way to approach, this particular issue, right, of getting some knives for your cooking class. Otherwise, you can certainly, consider any of the well-known brand names, whether it's Schön or Global or Messermeister or something else. There are a number of well-known, i.e. heavily marketed brands available to you. Many of those can still be a little bit expensive, again, depending on what your budget looks like. But the ones that I mentioned and many others are considered to be good quality. Now, I will mention a line of knives that I like as a good value, and that is the Victorinox brand. And that's the Swiss Army knife people. And several years ago, Consumer Reports magazine had listed their 8-inch chef's knife as their top pick. And, I use one from time to time, along with those other brands that I mentioned. And, at $40 or so for an 8-inch Victorinox chef's knife, it is probably the best value, in my opinion. In other words, I concur with Consumer Reports. I find that the Victorinox knife is hard. The metal is hard enough that it holds its edge for a reasonably long time, yet it's soft enough that once you put it on a whetstone for sharpening or a wheel, whatever you happen to be using, that's fairly easy to sharpen. And as you use a steel on a day-to-day maintenance basis, that's also very easy to use as well. And it's otherwise a stamped steel blade, so relatively low tech, certainly not in the category of a Schön or anything custom made, but it performs reasonably well. So do consider that. Thank you. Okay, next up. Why, when we sharpen a knife on a whetstone, we apply pressure as the blade's edge strokes off the stone so as to not carve into the stone. But when honing a knife with a steel, we carve the blade's edge into the steel. Aha, okay. I'm envisioning that process, right, as I read through the question here. And wow, let me, I guess I'll preface all this by saying that those two activities or actions are very different. And well, I've never compared the two in this way. So let me come up with an answer for you. When we're on a whetstone, I'm not worried so much about the stone, right, as I am about the blade, right? That's going to be the focal point. And I wish I had a knife with me here to show you, but at the cutting edge, at that very edge of the knife, where we're making contact with the whetstone, And we want to create this nice, even cutting edge. That is going to help that cutting edge last longer. It's going to give you better performance when you do use the knife. Okay. And so the action on the whetstone ideally is going to be very even in angle, the contact angle, as well as the pressure that we apply. Now, there are a number of different knife sharpening techniques, okay, that use a whetstone in different orientations. And so the wear pattern on a whetstone can vary quite a bit from user to user, okay? So again, I'm not worrying so much about the stone itself, but I'm focusing on the blade when I'm doing that occasional sharpening. Regarding the steel, right, which is what we use for daily maintenance. This is my depiction of a knife, okay, looking at that cutting edge, okay? As we use a knife and it starts to feel dull, it's because that cutting edge at the very edge is starting to roll over. And the goal with our daily maintenance on the steel is to straighten that back up. And that's when we put that steel right on the blade, or the blade against the steel. And excuse me just a second here. Now, when I use a steel, and this is certainly my recommendation for all of you, I'm not putting the blade against the steel with a lot of pressure. It's just not required, okay? The goal is simply to straighten up this edge, okay? So if it's rolled over in this direction, then I'm going to hit it with the steel until it straightens up, okay? Now, we are trained to put the knife against the steel from both sides. And that's to line up that cutting edge. What we need to do is we have to feel the edge of the blade with our finger to know, first of all, which way it's rolled, so we know which side to steel it on, right? Because it's rolled this way, but we're steeling it over here, then we're not going to fix the problem, okay? And then the next thing is we need to feel the blade so that we know when to stop stealing the blade or stop honing the blade. Because once it's straight, there's no need to continue to steel the blade. All right. Now, one thing that I see a lot of celebrity chefs do, in front of the camera, as they're looking at you, right, they're doing all this fancy work on the steel, and they're doing it about 20 times. That's totally unnecessary. That's all show business. Okay. You can steel your blade and have it all honed up probably, first of all, just in a matter of a few seconds. And probably just, with 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 strokes on each side. It just depends on how much tuning it needs. All right. So it should be a gentle process. You do it as much as it needs and not more. And you got to feel it with your fingers to see that it's even. So what you're going to feel is a burr. It'll feel rough this way and smooth this way. That makes sense, right? So as we straighten it up, it'll feel even, right, on both sides. So that's what we want to look for. All right. So don't look around. Don't talk to people. Focus on your knife, right, both when it's on the whetstone as well as the honing steel. All right. Thank you. All right. Next up from Holly. Last week, Ruby offered a live office hours for menu planning, but it really focused on batch prepping for the already made meal plan. I desperately need help with planning. I spend hours going through the recipes trying to put a plan together to no avail. Okay. for menu planning. Okay, so Holly, I'm going to have you please reach out to me at support@ruby.com. And let's take up this question one-on-one so I can better understand what your desired outcomes are, okay, and all the other details in between. Thank you. And the next question, what is the best way to keep guacamole from turning brown when entertaining? There it is. So when guacamole browns, actually, you know, an experiment from years ago comes to mind. That's why I'm laughing here. And there used to be, you know, a recommendation to put the avocado pit, you know, in the guacamole, and to see if that would be effective. I think some people still think it's the best solution. I no longer do. Because you know, this test revealed that once you remove the pit, you know, very often just that little indentation where the pit was remains very vibrant green and fresh looking, but there you can see some oxidation around the edges. And so the other part of the experiment was to put a light bulb into your guacamole. And then after a while, pull that out. And sure enough, that divot that was left behind was bright green and fresh looking, but the surrounding areas were a little oxidized. But anyway, so what goes on here with the enzymatic browning, right, is that we need to slow that process down. And so enzymatic browning is enhanced with contact with the air. So, you know, if you, first of all, as you store your guacamole, if you put plastic wrap over it and push the plastic wrap down to the surface to make contact with the guacamole, it's going to slow down that browning process, enzymatic browning from the enzymes. The addition of acid also will slow down that process. And so that's why lime juice is very commonly added to guacamole. And those are the two methods that work very well. Now, of course, once you're entertaining, you got to pull the plastic off of your guacamole bowl. And then you've got some lime juice in there. And, you know, that will help. Salt may even help a little bit as well. Probably have salt in that recipe too, okay? A cooler temperature will also help. So keep a backup in the refrigerator rather than at room temperature. Okay, so those three or so things should help that process. Thanks. And the next question, what aspect of a completed dish would you consider the most important? Taste, technique, concept, execution, presentation, originality of the dish. Wow, I like all of those. Is there an all of the above option? You know, I think it depends on, I don't know, it depends on the context, I suppose. You know, on one hand, if you could roll all those into a dish that I got to eat, that would be pretty fun. It'd give me something to think about. Something to look at, and something to enjoy on the palate as well. I mean, I think, you know, the first thing, you know, as a consumer, what we tend to enjoy is the taste of the food, right? The flavors, the aromas, that palate enjoyment aspect of the food. Now, a lot of that comes from, right, is a result of these other things that you have listed here. And, you know, what cooking method or techniques go into the dish will affect its look, its texture, its some aspects of its taste or flavor. You know, how it's executed, right, I think is sort of part and parcel of that discussion as well. The presentation, I think, certainly has importance because, and as that saying goes, we eat with our eyes first. So, you know, bright colors and, you know, nice arrangements certainly affect our perception of the food, right? Which influences the way we experience the food on the palate as well. The originality of the dish, for day-to-day eating, that's probably not top of mind, because if I or somebody else replicates a recipe and they do it really well, then the originality of that dish, I'm not going to hold that against them. On the other hand, an original dish, one's original creation, can also be wonderful. Again, providing it's executed properly with good technique and it tastes good. All right. And on the other hand, if I'm judging food, okay, and to the extent that I can, I'm judging your food, right? Each time you submit an assignment. There have been many instances where I have been a judge for a cooking contest. I've certainly judged, my students at the on-ground cooking schools. And in those cases, I'm looking at all of those aspects, and I'm providing feedback on all those aspects. So it just depends on the context. Thank you. All right, next up, I live at 8,000 feet, and although I can usually get fresh vegetables, I sometimes need to use frozen. Is there a way to use frozen veggies without them becoming mushy? Also, baking tips would be nice, as results are hit and miss. It may be me, not 8,000 feet. Okay. So when we talk about frozen produce, please keep in mind that, basically, right, when water freezes, water in the vegetables, in this case, freezes, water expands, and it will rupture or tear the cell membrane, such that when you thaw that product, it starts to lose water and lose that stiffness that it had in its fresh state. All right. So, I would expect a previously frozen product to be a little bit, soft once it's thawed. So if we're going to further cook that to prepare something, then it's going to be up to us to really control the temperature and the time application. Okay. Time needs to be considered. If you want to maintain some of the firmness to the extent possible, then probably exposing that product to a very high heat for a very short period of time is your best bet. The longer the heat has time to penetrate, the softer it's going to get. And that's typical cooking. So if you combine that with an already flaccid vegetable that was previously frozen, then it's going to be even more mushy. And so it is possible, right, to control the firmness, but it'll take some practice on your part. Okay. And then the second part of your question addresses baking. Yeah, there are a number of things to keep in mind. And Patrick has just posted a link to some information on cooking and baking at high altitude. So please take a look at this for some tips. There are many other sites as well online where you can get information on cooking and baking at high altitude. Thank you. Next question: are ceramic nonstick pans safe and healthy to use, or are there better options for nonstick cooking? As for safety and health, I don't know anything about the ceramic cookware. My bet is, since they are allowed to be sold, that they're probably basically safe. In terms of health, I think we're all guinea pigs, right? We don't know those true answers until the data comes in, sometimes decades later. So that's kind of where we are with some of these nonstick surfaces. Is there a better option? I don't know. I use a nonstick pan on occasion, and it's one of these pans from my nearby restaurant supply store. It's one that is commonly used in restaurants. The manufacturer is Volrath. The surface is Wherever. They all get scratched up. I consider them disposable. And, in the meantime, is it safe and healthy? I don't know. I don't use it as my main pan, but just on occasion when I have persnickety things to cook. Let's keep our eye out, okay, on any updates on ceramic cookware. Thank you. All right, next question. I greatly value a good index in cookbooks by ingredients and by title. But in my FOK course, I find it so difficult to find things back. I can bookmark things, make notes, but how do I search by ingredient or by technique? Did I overlook a search bar? Myra, no, I don't think you've overlooked a search bar. As for searching by ingredient or by technique, we do not have that function, but I'm happy to pass that message along to my colleagues who could possibly help, and we'll see what they think about this possibility. Okay, thank you. All right, next question from Cindy. Can you please explain how to make tamales without lard or oil in the masa and have them come out moist and fluffy? Quick answer is no. A tamal in its traditional form, and in even all the non-traditional tamales that I've eaten and that I've made, require fat. I mean, that's really a big part of the mouthfeel. At least I haven't discovered another approach. Those that don't use lard, I have used 50% butter, 50% olive oil. I have used all olive oil. Any of those can work very well. The advantage, number one, with lard is that when you whip the lard, you're incorporating air, which gives a lighter texture to the end product. The combination of butter and olive oil can achieve that same effect as you incorporate air into the butter. Oil doesn't capture air or trap air in that same way, but if you can mix that into the masa, you can loosen that up a little bit, but it does take some fat. I have had some tamales that were too dry. In other words, they were made, according to a proper recipe, but for whatever reason, there wasn't enough fat incorporated in it. And it just came out awfully, and I emphasis on awful here, awfully dry. So I can't imagine a tamal without added fat, okay? I think it becomes something else. So please keep that in mind, but if you do find a solution, let me know. I'm curious what that would be like. Thank you. All right, next up, I've had success for keeping guacamole from turning brown by putting a glass saucer in direct contact with the guacamole and a little air left as possible. Okay, perfect. Your suggestion is perfect, Nancy, right? Another way to minimize air contact and therefore slow down that enzymatic browning. Thank you. Next up, can you please speak about the proper care for knives in regard to cleaning, storage, and sharpening? I'm getting ready to invest and want them to last for years to come. Yes, okay. So for knives, you bet, get for everybody, right? Get a good knife, whatever price point is going to work for you, but a good quality knife. and it'll last you for the rest of your life. All right, I'll start out by saying that. And then in terms of care, when it comes to cleaning, I'm in the habit of cleaning my knife immediately after I use it. And so in between any tasks, it's cleaned and it's set down next to the cutting board. If I'm finished cooking, then I'm going to dry it off and then I put it away. All right. Now, certainly depending on the type of knife that you have, that becomes perhaps even more critical. If you have a knife that uses a metal that's got some carbon in it, then you need to clean it and dry it immediately to avoid the oxidation or that rusting process that'll begin. In terms of storage, try to put it in a place where it's not going to bang up against other items, especially other metallic items. Otherwise, the blade will be dulled faster than usual. But otherwise, there are many options for storage. It could be a magnetic strip on the wall, right, that can grab onto that knife but not have it make contact with anything else. It could be in a knife block, in which case where possible, I like to put the cutting edge facing up, just so it's not making contact with anything else, including the wood, if possible. There are individual sheaths that you can put onto the blade to protect them, which is a nice way to go as well. And there are many other designs for storage systems that will hold a knife individually and protect it from banging into other things. So I think that's going to be important. And then, use a honing steel on a daily basis. Probably once a day is going to be fine for most home cooks. If you're in a professional setting and you're using your knife a lot, then it might be a couple of times a day. And, if you're going to consider sharpening, right, which is a more occasional maintenance technique, then it's going to be sharpened as needed. And that could be once a year, plus or minus a little bit, depending on what your frequency of use is, the hardness of things that you're cutting, as well as the type of metal that your blade is made from. Okay? And, as you think about sharpening, if you decide to do your own sharpening and you use a whetstone, I strongly recommend that you practice first on a less expensive knife, one that you can just sort of grind away on, because a coarse whetstone can take a lot of metal off in a very short period of time. And, I would recommend that you keep your prized possessions, your expensive knives for, when you have practiced a bit on the less expensive knives. All right. Thank you. All right. Next up, I'm brand new and work full time. I'm hoping that learning the platform is the most crucial first step, and am taking my time with that. If I end up needing an extension to finish the course with a certificate, how hard is it to receive an extension? Extension is very easy to get. No problem at all. Just, wait till you get to that point, and then we'll cross that bridge together. Just reach out to Ruby support, right? So support@ruby.com, and, we can walk you through that process. Okay. But otherwise, yeah, you bet. Just, our courses are designed ideally to progress through them sequentially, so that some of the first information you're going to encounter is how to interact with the learning and management system, right, the LMS. And then we start, to get into some of the food handling and cooking. All right. And then it just builds from there. So I think you're in the perfect place, all right, as you start out. Thank you. And Next up, what is the best way to train your palate for the varying tastes like umami? Well, I think as we think about training the palate in the taste department, first of all, I would suggest that you get some foods that are typical examples of that given taste, right? So if it's umami, we might think about some kombu, right, or a nice kombu dashi that you might sip on, and it could be mushrooms or other ingredients again that characterize that taste. And then taste them, right, and start to describe them, the fullness, that sort of I guess sense of satisfaction that we sometimes use to describe the taste of or the experience of umami. And as we move on to flavors and aromas, then I would consider a wine flavor or aroma wheel as one tool to use. There are other tools, but that's going to be one to consider because it also has a lot of vocabulary attached to it. And it's really the vocabulary, right, that we want to learn at the same time so that we can start to talk about this stuff. It's also very helpful to do your tasting with somebody that has more experience than you, so that you can better identify what it is that you're experiencing and put a name to it. In other words, it's very common for consumers to be tasting something but not realize they're tasting it because they haven't labeled it. And we like to label things in order for us to recognize it. That's just one way that we function in our world. So to work with somebody who's more experienced can be very helpful. And then also I've come across a situation very often where a person is tasting something, a flavor, for example, and they're labeling it incorrectly. All right. And so to find common alignment is important. And we can do that if we work with somebody who has more experience. Okay, so those are a couple of things to keep in mind. Thank you. All right, I got another question from Sammy. My assignment to make plant-based or tofu ricotta manicotti. So instead of plant-based, may I use normal ricotta? Also, regarding red wine pickled onion, what is the substitute for agave? Okay, so let's take a look at the first question here. So it sounds like, let's see, yes, okay. So I'm, Sammy, if I remember, you're in the Pro Cook course. That's our long 6-month certificate program. And in that program, we have a section on plant-based alternatives. And the goal is, right, as a well-rounded cook, right, coming out of our program, that you have experience in these various areas of cooking, so that you can accommodate different guests. And so we have inserted this plant-based section. So it is our desire, right, that you produce the manicotti filling, this ricotta filling, using the tofu, making, in other words, a plant-based ricotta filling, so that you have the experience of developing the flavor, understanding the texture, and producing a beautiful end product that could satisfy a guest who wanted a plant-based item. Okay, so that we ask you to use the plant-based filling in this case. Now, when it comes to pickled onions, and if agave syrup is used, it's going to be as a source of balancing sweetness. So any other source of sweetness is going to be fine. So it could be sugar, right? It could be honey, it could be anything else. Keep in mind that if you are using white granulated sugar, that it will be flavor neutral. It will have the taste of sweetness, but it won't have a flavor. So it's going to be neutral. As we reach toward honey or date syrup or sorghum or something else, it'll have sweetness, but it will also have an accompanying flavor as well as a color. So think about the flavor and color accompaniments and decide, which is going to be best for your application and your desired outcome. All right, thank you. Okay, and next up, regarding comments by folks not wanting to use tofu for plant-based manicotti unless you are allergic to it. Soy is very healthful and cancer prevented, while dairy is the opposite. I have a nutrition certificate, strongly recommend tofu unless truly allergic. Yeah, good point, Hannah. I totally agree with that. And I think from there's different ways to look at this, right? I think certainly if you want to think about it from a health perspective, which is a fantastic lens through which to look at food, then we should talk about that. Very often if I'm cooking professionally for somebody, if I'm catering for somebody, if I'm working in a restaurant, and I have a client that comes in or a guest that sits down in the dining room and, they want something plant-based, I'm not really thinking about the nutrition as my number one, but rather, how do I otherwise satisfy the need of that guest? And so it's a little bit of a different angle, but nonetheless, I think there's some overlap and totally relevant, right, in terms of why we should have some experience in the plant-based world. All right, thanks, Hannah. All right, next up, when making the cashew sour cream, to get a more sour profile, do I add more vinegar? I didn't have white wine vinegar, so I used a champagne vinegar. Thoughts on how to get it to come closer to the sour cream taste, as it seemed a little sweet. Okay, so yeah, there's a couple of approaches here. You can certainly use vinegar, which is going to be a quick source of sourness. And let's see here. In terms of what type of vinegar to use, you mentioned white wine vinegar. Champagne vinegar can also work. I'm also a fan of rice vinegar or rice wine vinegar, which often has just a little bit lower acidity and some accompanying flavor that comes along. You can also consider fermenting that on your own to develop some natural sourness. And, you can do that by getting probiotic capsules, opening those up and sprinkling the powder, into the cashew cream, and then letting that sit for some time until that bacteria develops. And that's another way to introduce some sourness. Okay, so give that a try. Thank you. All right, next up. I picked up a knife sharpener that has two slots, smaller and a longer one, to put the knife in and move it back and forth. Is it acceptable, and how often would you recommend to sharpen knives? Also, where should it be stored when it's not in use? So this type of a sharpener absolutely is acceptable, right? It's going to be totally up to you, right, as to what you are comfortable with or what you want to use. But something like this is very much acceptable. I am guessing that since you're asking about where it should be stored, that this might be an electric device, so a little bit of a larger device, perhaps. I've seen manual versions that are very small, that you pull your knife through, and they're easily stored in a drawer. In the case of a storage location, really wherever it's going to be convenient to you, you're probably going to use this only occasionally, again, just as needed, while you use your honing steel on a daily basis for frequent maintenance. But for the sharpener, once your blade gets to the point where the honing steel doesn't help, that's when you want to put it on the sharpener. And so, it could be once every couple of months, or it could be a couple of times a year. Again, just depends on your frequency of use, and how the knife is cared for in the meantime. Okay. I'll also add, okay, that these the type of a sharpener that you're describing will put an edge on the knife that is pretty good, all right, but usually not as good as a whetstone will do, okay? But there's a trade-off here, because a whetstone has a learning curve. And until you make your way up that learning curve, there's a chance of having knives that are not optimally sharp, or even possibly damaging your knife, right, until you practice on a lesser expensive knife, for example. So if you're not interested in a whetstone, then this is a good alternative, okay? But again, if you want to compare the two, once a person develops skill on a whetstone, that's usually the preferred technology to use. You can always send your knife out to somebody, right, who uses a whetstone or a sharpening wheel, an automated wheel. And if they're skilled, they can put a very nice edge on your knife that will last a long time. Okay, so just a few extra thoughts to put into context the technology here and the options. Thank you. All right, next question. I'm new to the vegan lifestyle. I want to make sure to get all vitamins, protein, and nutrients. Is there a guideline that I can follow to balance each day meal that describe amount of protein and vitamin intake per recipe? Here at Ruby, we do not provide that kind of information. You can certainly look up that kind of information on the interwebs. There are, I think, many websites that can provide a nutrient profile for a given food item, or even a preparation, a dish of some sort, okay? However, I will say that if you, for most people, most of the time, all right, if you're eating a varied plant-based diet, that the nutrients are not a concern, okay? And, certainly when we think about vitamins and minerals, all these beautiful phytonutrients, you get ample nutrients from plants. When it comes to protein, not a problem at all. Every food that you eat will contain amino acids, and amino acids are the building blocks for protein. And your body has the intelligence to know how to produce the protein. It's our job to give our body a variety of foods. All right, so we have some balance in our diet, and then our body does the rest for us. Okay, but if you're interested, right, in looking at the nutrition profile of different ingredients and different preparations, there is information on the interwebs. Thank you. Let's see. So Marco is asking, where can I find a large countertop burner I bought a very large pan, but the burners I have at home are too small to heat it evenly. I would direct you to some sort of a restaurant supply store, whether it is a place in your own town or whether it's an online source. And, you're bound to find some options, whether they're gas or electric or an induction burner that will be large enough to accommodate pans that would be found in a restaurant, so larger capacity pans. Okay, but definitely a restaurant supply store. Okay, whether on ground or online. Give that a try. Thank you. All right. Next up from Arti. Hello. I came across plantain fritters, plantain pakora recipe, which included egg in the gram flour, right, or besan, which is chickpea flour batter. What is the function of eggs here? To make the batter airy, or is there any other science involved as well? Okay, so now I'll begin by saying that, of course, the eggs are not necessary, right? If we wanted to have a plant-based version or otherwise a version that is probably more traditional to what I find in South Asia. But the function of the eggs. So, eggs, we say that eggs add structure or create structure. So in other words, it gives us a chewiness in a batter once it's cooked. And eggs also, when they're whipped, will hold air. This is true of egg whites as well as whole eggs, and egg yolks too. So they will provide some airiness, as you're describing it. Some thickness to the batter as it adheres to the plantain pieces, the plantain slices. So those are the two main things that come to mind in terms of the eating experience, right? A little bit of substance, the chewiness, as well as the retention of air. Of course, there is some flavor that comes from eggs, but in this batter mixture, especially with the besan, we're probably not going to pick up on the egg flavor. And certainly if you add any masala, any spices to it, we're not going to pick up on the egg flavor. There's also nutrition that comes from the eggs. All right, so those are the things that come to mind. Thank you. All right, from Tamiko again. Thank you for the tips on the cashew sour cream and developing my palate. Very helpful. I was wondering if I could have added rice wine vinegar because I had plenty of that in the cabinet. Yeah, you bet. In fact, I always have a whole bunch in the cabinet, and it's probably my go-to vinegar in the house, and definitely give that a try. All right, see how you like it. Thank you. And from Hannah, a little follow-up here, it looks like. I also recently saw a vegan Mexican chef explaining that she makes her crema agria Mexican-style sour cream using almonds instead of cashews because she finds cashews too sweet. Yeah, excellent. That is for sure. Thank you, Hannah, for mentioning that. I think of the common nuts available to us, cashews probably do have the sweetest profile. And so switching to something else would help tone that down. Thank you. Let's see. And Tamiko says, thanks for the suggestion for trying almonds. Excellent. All right, next up. From Sammy again, I want to do homemade pasta, but I want to use gluten-free flour. Do I use the same techniques for all-purpose flour or the double aught? Or there's a different method I should do? Fundamentally, the technique is going to be the same, okay? As you use a gluten-free flour, especially one that's going to be store-bought, you're going to find In my experience, you're going to find the addition of a gum, sometimes a couple of different gums, a guar gum, for example, and that really is intended to mimic the performance of the gluten, right, that would otherwise be found, right, in the wheat flour. And that's going to give it some structure. And otherwise proceed as normal, right, in terms of the methods and the techniques. If you're making your own gluten-free flour, I would recommend starting with some sort of a guideline, and eventually getting to the point where you're adding a gum, right, for that structure. I think you'll probably find that to be necessary. Probably. But yeah, definitely give that a try, though. All right, thank you. All right, next question. I made a potato salad recipe from the course, and the flavor was too heavy on the vinegar. What can I add to tone it down without starting over? Let's see here. The first thing that comes to mind, so it sounds like you've got a batch of potato salad that's just sour, right? The first thing that comes to mind for me is to bulk it up, to thin out that sour taste, which would mean, something starchy like potatoes would be the easiest single ingredient to add, in which case you'd probably need to, also adjust the quantity of the dressing too. But if you wanted to add some other ingredients to bulk it up, that would certainly work, depending on what style potato salad you wanted to end up with. You might try adding a touch of sweetener to see, the balancing effect and if that's going to be acceptable to you. Okay. Otherwise, you're bound to have a little bit of the sourness kind of sneaking through. But try those two approaches: bulking it up, ideally with something starchy, but just with something more, as well as the balancing act of sweetness. Thank you. Janice is asking, how long can we store the bechamel sauce in the freezer? Can we also store udon noodles in the freezer, and how long would that be? So how long can we store the bechamel sauce in the freezer? So, the bechamel can store for as long as you want it to, really. Keeping in mind, generally speaking, that as we put things in the freezer, they will decline in quality no matter what it is. So the sooner you get to it, the better it's going to be. Also keep in mind that the bechamel, right, it's a roux stabilized sauce, right, a roux thickened sauce. So it's going to be typical to experience some breakage as it thaws. In other words, some separation of the fat component as it thaws, and in which case you should be able to reincorporate that with a whisk once it's warmed up. There's going to be enough starch in there to capture that fatness again. Although there may be an opportunity that it doesn't all incorporate. So do keep that in mind. Okay, you might have a little bit of looseness around the edges with some additional fattiness. But otherwise, proceed with that and whisk it together and see how that comes together. Udon, you bet. You can store udon in the freezer, and it'll last for a while. Again, frozen things can last for months, but as I mentioned, with a slow but steady decline in quality. My recommendation is to freeze it pretty quickly after you make it, and then also to use it pretty quickly after it's thawed. I find that after noodles sit in the refrigerator, in particular, that they develop dark spots. It's still edible, but not the most interesting to look at. Okay, but yeah, give that a try and just see how that fits into the rhythm of your kitchen. All right, thank you. Next question. How do you wash root vegetables, leafy greens, berries, other fruits, and citrus fruits for the skin? Do you use something besides water? Which do you wash before storage and which before use? I use a brush. Sometimes it's the scouring side of a two-sided sponge, but just some sort of an abrasive to get some of the loose dirt off, and or anything that's visible. I guess sometimes it's not obvious, but the rinse water is dirty. Any of these harder items, like apples and citrus and root vegetables, I will often rinse them first, dry them quickly and thoroughly, and then store them. But I'm not 100% disciplined around that. Sometimes I just end up washing them as I use them, which works fine as well. So I think either path is effective. Leafy items I tend to wash before I use them. And berries, same thing with berries. When it comes to probably most berries, I'll rinse those right before I consume them or right before I use them. If it's important to remove all the water, then I'll spread them out single layer on an absorbent towel, and maybe grab each end of the towel and just give it a quick little jiggle so that the berries kind of move around a bit and the water has a chance to be absorbed by the towel, and then move on, right? In terms of, again, going back to some of these harder items, take a look at what works best in your environment, okay? Sometimes when we wash an item first, especially if we scour the skin, and pieces of the skin come off, and if you're in a hot, humid environment, sometimes that's not the best way to pre-treat the food item, because mold might set in sooner than later. So figure out what's going to be best, okay, for your particular locale. All right, thank you. All right, and Cindy has shared with us nutritionfacts.org, right, as having the best whole food plant-based info. You bet. Take a look at that. Nice source of information. And let's see, from Janice again. Can we freeze the vegetable broth? Yes, that freezes very nicely. And how long can we freeze it? Same sort of thing, right? It'll hold for months, but try to get to it sooner than later. I recommend storing it in a container that would reflect the amount that you might use in the future. And so it could be a pint container or a quart container, for example. That way you're not working with some large unit that needs to be thawed in its entirety, only for you to use a smaller quantity of that. All right. Also, what other sauces can we freeze that do not change the texture of the sauce? Generally speaking, sauces freeze well. The ones that are less stable upon thawing are the ones that have been thickened, that have been emulsified, like a hollandaise, or thickened, with a roux. If it's going to be any unthickened sauce, tomato sauce, for example, those all freeze very, very nicely. Okay. So give that a try, and again, see how you like the results. And also depends on how you're going to use it, right? If you're freezing a bechamel or a velouté, to be used in a soup or a stew versus a small sauce on the plate, then your results might be better, in a soup or a stew. But again, give it a try and see how you like that. All right, thank you. And Janice again, look at that. How do we heat a frozen sauce. Does it need to be thawed first? Do you have any recipe for vegan chips or vegan chicharrones? Wow. Okay. I would love, or no, I would appreciate it if you would share it with us. Thank you. All right. So let's pick these off one by one. How do you heat a frozen sauce? I typically thaw them. And so budget how much time is required for the size of the frozen unit. Sometimes they require an overnight thaw. Sometimes it's just a few hours. Okay. But I prefer to thaw them first. And let's see. And I'll explain this. So depending on the type of sauce, okay, so particularly if it's one that does not have a roux or a thickener added to it. So if it's going to be a tomato sauce, for example, when they thaw, right, very often they thaw unevenly. And you can, if you try to use it before it's completely thawed, sometimes you'll use up the water component unevenly. Whereas if you allow the whole thing to thaw, then you can mix it all together and kind of reincorporate or redistribute everything and then use it evenly. So that's my reason for thawing. Vegan chips. Now vegan chicharrones, I don't know. But in terms of vegan chips, generally, it's really just a matter of frying your own. And I think, any sort of, the typical suspects, right, when it comes to chips, any root vegetables, whether it's a potato or a plantain or a beet or a cassava or something else, put that on a what's this? The thin slicer. What's that called? I forget. But and then drop that directly into the hot oil, and you're going to have some beautiful chips. The thinner they are, right, the lighter and sort of light and crispy they are. But you can kind of adjust that thickness depending on what you want to do with it. What's that? A mandolin. Thank you very much, Patrick. I get little answers in my ear here. If you've got a mandolin to use, you can adjust that thickness very conveniently. All right. So give that a try, Janice. All right. Thank you very much. And if you find a good way to make vegan chicharrones, let me know. I'd like to check that out. Thank you. All right. So Hannah, I have an embarrassingly hard time roasting or baking whole sweet potatoes. With bigger ones, I try slightly lower temps, longer times, more like 350 versus up to 400 degrees Fahrenheit for smaller, but they always seem to take forever to cook properly. Tips. Hannah, I'm happy to tell you, what I do. Just as recently as yesterday morning, I baked or roasted a half sheet pan, aluminum, 15 gauge, just kidding, right, of sweet potatoes. And I've been roasting them lately at 350, and they will take over an hour. Depends on the size. I had some different sizes on the sheet pan, but definitely some of these were, as big as my fist in the thickest areas. And boy, these probably went I checked them at about 55 minutes, but I ended up putting probably another 20 or so minutes on them. What I look for is for the sweet potato to start to ooze some syrup. And what that tells me is that on the inside, there's this transformation of the starchy component into sugar and that syrup. And they come out with a beautiful texture and just intense sweetness. And from there, I eat them as a snack, sometimes as a snack with my coffee in the morning, maybe tea in the afternoon. Sometimes I drizzle some date syrup on them if I want something even sweeter, but usually they don't need that. But anyway, that's what I do. And give that a try. Just give it enough time. I'd expect over an hour until you develop that beautiful syrup that starts to ooze out of them. All right. Thank you. All right. Next up from Sharon. I'm working on the Forks Over Knives Task 66 activity, roasting vegetables while listening to this session. But here's my question. Is there a particular type and brand of knife sharpener you suggest for at-home cooks? No, nothing comes to mind. Let me kind of run through this here. If we're talking about a honing steel, first of all, that's not what you mentioned, but let me just mention that, a honing steel. Most any that you find online will do. There are some that are described as having a diamond coating on them, and they have a very fine edge, and I find those to work very nicely. So in the honing steel category, consider that. If it's a sharpener, if it's an electric sharpener or something with those grooves in it that you pull your knife through, I always recommend looking at sort of industry ratings or consumer ratings. Read the comments and then decide what might work best for you. I don't have a particular favorite at all. Okay. When it comes to sharpening stones, here too, there are many to choose from. So I recommend that you take a look at some ratings online to determine what might be best for you, in that category. All right. Thank you. All right. Holly says, thank you for offering live office hours. I learned so much from them and enjoy watching the ones I miss. Holly, thank you very much for your feedback. I appreciate it. We all appreciate it. And I think most of all, we appreciate that you're participating here and that you find benefit in our programs. And, keep on checking out our archived live events as well. There are so many different topics that you can take a look at. Thank you. All right, next up. How much time does a student enrolled in the basic course have to complete the course? So, Sheila, it depends specifically what the course is. So I'll give a couple of examples. Forks Over Knives, which is our most common, most popular course, is a 90-day, a 3-month course. You can always get an extension if that is necessary, however. All right. And then our longer courses are 6-month courses, so Pro Plant and Pro Cook. And those two, you can get an extension as needed. Thank you. All right. Another question from Tamiko. The highest speed blender I currently have is the NutriBullet, and I have a food processor. Which is best to get a smooth bechamel sauce? I'm not sure. I haven't used a NutriBullet, and it would certainly depend on the food processor that you have, the specifications of that particular model. In terms of their performance relative to one another. Now let's talk about a bechamel sauce. I'm guessing that you're talking about the plant-based bechamel, right? The cashew white sauce. If it's just as a tangent here, if it's a traditional bechamel, then that's all done in the pan, right? And no blender and no food processor is needed. But if we're talking about the cashew-based or the nut-based, plant-based version, then give each of those a try, okay, and see which results are best, right, in terms of the smoothness on the palate, because it really depends on the specific model that you have, all right? But otherwise, as a broader topic for making plant-based, these nut-based sauces, If you have what's often called a high-speed blender, Blend Tech and Vitamix are the two most popular brands. Those have really powerful motors, and they spin at a pretty high clip, and the results are very smooth. They have their limitations, but the results are very smooth for most of these plant-based sauces or these nut-based sauces that we're talking about. Okay, so consider that, if that's possible. Thank you. All right, next up, my biggest challenge with menu planning and cooking for the family is all the different dietary restrictions and preferences. Frankly, it's overwhelming. 2 are vegetarian, 1 is dairy-free, gluten-free, 2 are all meat, the more the better. Any tips? Okay. These are fun challenges, or maybe not. Maybe they're overwhelming at times. I can appreciate that too. Okay, so, all meat, the more the better. Well, I guess that's one. If we can move those folks into the plant-based category, then we can simplify things, right? But if it's all meat, then I guess you're in a position of having to produce, at least one, right, meat-based dish at mealtime. Okay, but everything else, right, could probably be plant-based. Okay, let's start with that, right, as a filter to simplifying all of this. All right. All right, vegetarian, no problem. Okay, we'll just slot them in where we need to here. I think the bigger concern is going to be dairy-free, gluten-free. Probably not a big deal. I think if we can move the 2 vegetarians and the dairy-free person into like a whole food plant-based track, right? Then that's going to be that next filter, right, to work with. And then, gluten-free is not a big deal. We can pretty quickly eliminate all of our wheat-based ingredients in the kitchen. Okay, no problem. But focus on whole food, plant-based. Okay, and that takes care of the vegetarians and the dairy-free person. Okay, and then those meat eaters, well, we still have to produce something for them. So that's going to be an additional dish. All right. So start with that filter, whole food, plant-based, plus 1 meat dish. And I think you've got everyone covered. And let's, work on flavor development, interesting textures, great colors, and see what the satisfaction level looks like at mealtime. All right. Thank you. If you have more specific questions that come up, reach out at support@ruby.com, and we can, take on the specific questions one by one. Thank you. All right, Sarah says, thank you. Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate you being here. This is a lot of fun for me, and good to know that you're enjoying the sessions as well. As a whole food, plant-based chef, what were the adaptations that helped maximize flavor for you? I'm not trying to replicate meat, just make veggies delicious. Yeah, you bet. There's, I think, a couple of categories, a couple of areas of consideration. One is to start incorporating spices and herbs. I like fresh herbs, but any herbs will do. But spices and herbs are very important to me, and I always recommend them. And you can probably find at least one archived live event where I talk more about spices. And in fact, there's an additional live event where I talk about flavor development and different techniques. And those are archived. Take a look at those. The other thing that I'll touch upon here very quickly is to consider cooking methods, right? Where browning introduces a lot of flavor. Now, we get browning from sautéing, from roasting, from grilling, in addition to frying, okay, as the common cooking methods. And, those are my quick answers. Okay. But, again, take a look at the archived live events that address those two areas, flavor development, and then more specifically spices, for some additional discussion. All right. Thank you. All right. Next up, any suggestions for making a cheese sauce without nutritional yeast? I like to use it for mac and cheese and for queso. Consider miso paste. And, if you are able to accommodate other yeast products, consider that, like Vegemite. But my first go-to would be miso paste to get some interesting flavor. There are different types of miso pastes, so you can get more sweetness or more salt. They also differ in color, so you've got some different presentation options as well. Okay, and it looks like Patrick has just posted links to a couple of the archived live events, one on spices and one on flavor development. Thank you. All right. And scrolling on down here. Thank you, Barbara, for your feedback. I always enjoy sharing, whatever my, experiences I might have here. I love this way of learning. I have many food allergies, and among them is yeast. I love nutritional yeast, but would appreciate a suitable replacement if there is one. As I just mentioned, consider miso paste, if that works for you. Sometimes I'll reach for mole paste, which I'll pick up at a Mexican market, or sometimes I'll make some myself. As a great source of flavor that can be used in a lot of different preparations. It doesn't have to be those traditional dishes that we might associate with miso paste or with mole. Okay. So give that a try and see where that takes you. Thank you. And Hannah. All right. So the discussion about stealing the blade is fantastic. Thank you. You bet. You are very welcome. I'll try to practice feeling for the slight burr. Okay, for stealing. Yeah, very important. And I see I had thought blade dulled kind of to both sides or something. Way helpful. Okay, yeah, you bet. Give that a try. And again, don't spend too much time stealing the knife. It's just a quick job. All right. Thank you, Hannah. Nancy says, would avocado work for the tamales in place of lard? I don't know. I've never tried avocados, but give it a try and see how you like the results. And let me know what you come up with. I'm very curious. Thank you. And next up, thank you. I'll check out the link. My husband's birthday cake is always about 3 inches high on one side and eight inches on the other. Tastes good though. That's pretty funny, Melissa. Yeah, give that a try. Some of that high altitude, baking tips. All right. Thank you. All right. So I bet some aquafaba and a reduced amount of oil might actually be worth testing in tamales. Very interesting. Very interesting, Hannah. Let me know what you come up with. And I think I'll give that a try myself. Wonderful. Thank you. All right. I was thinking about the same thing, says Cindy. We'll try for sure. Awesome. I just love the conversation here. Thanks so much for your participation. And looks like the last one here from Peggy. Thanks for all the information. Enjoying the office hours. For new vegans, they should add B12 supplement to their diet. Yeah, you bet. This day and age, it's very strongly recommended that folks that are all plant-based take a B12 supplement just to make sure that we get that in our diets in adequate amounts, since our sources from the soil historically don't seem to be adequate or be there anymore due to all the soil inputs these days that probably disrupt that balance. So yes, good news. To mention here, Peggy, is the B12 supplement. Thank you so much. And this brings us to the end of today's office hours. Thanks so much for your participation. And as I mentioned, I really like the conversational tone that we have through your participation. And I look forward to seeing you all again next time. Thank you very much. Bye now.